So yeah, I'm going to talk about the benefits and dangers of like design and component libraries, why you should consider using them or why you might not want to bother using them really. Bit about me first. I'm Claire. I do a lot of ranting about accessibility most of the time, which is what people might have recognized me from other talks about that. And I'm a software engineer at Bizarre Voice in Belfast. You can find me on Twitter or Slack or everywhere basically, and I'll be around here for the rest of the day and for the after party, of course. So yeah, what is a design component library? What are we actually talking about? Basically, it's about building a big set of blocks almost, so that whenever you come to make a project, you have those blocks ready to use. Sort of just the idea that, like, you know, every time that you go to build an app, you're not really going to want to build everything from scratch every time. Like a lot of us now, probably if you don't use component libraries, you copy and paste little bits and little snippets from projects you've done before. It's basically just like a sort of formalizing version of that. You want to have all the bits together so that whenever you're ready to start working, you can use them and reuse them and keep them organized. So we'll kind of go through why, well, some examples of that, and then why you might want to do it and what to watch out for if you do it. Common sort of versions of this, sort of the three that you know most people would say. There's publicly available ones, so you know, something that you can grab online, throw into your project. A lot of people use these. Company specific, so if you've got a company, you might have one version that's been built internally and everyone uses, or just something for a specific app or a specific, you know, set of sites for a company. Material design, I think, is the one that everyone, people go, oh, like design libraries, that means material design, that's those circular buttons and shadows. So material design is technically not a UI library, it's material UI is a UI library, material design is a design language, that's what Google call it. But it's basically the same concept. It's just the idea of basically using design as a language, as a way to describe what you want to build, so that whenever you come to build it, you have all these bits and pieces already, and you're not sort of trying to describe things in terms of browser components and browser elements and things like that. This is one of the goals of material design as I describe it, but it's basically just explaining that. It's explaining the idea of having one system that covers everything that you want to build, everything that you want to show to people, so that it all makes sense and it all feels like one system. I'll go into that a bit later in the benefits section as well. Bootstrap is obviously one of the ones that everyone's heard of, specifically on the UI side. I personally don't really work with it, but I mean, it's a fairly common thing that you can just grab and throw into whatever you want. If you just want all your buttons to look the same and all your drop downs to look nice and they look better than the browser versions of them, and you don't want to have to worry about it, it's just an easy way to keep things consistent. Similar with semantic UI, it's a similar sort of idea. Company specific version, like I mentioned, Atlassian, so they also do have a sort of public library that you can grab, but I'm just using this as an example to say Atlassian, so they have a bunch of projects. I'm sure a lot of people here at one point have had to use Jira and Confluence, all those sorts of things, and the point is that when you go on to Jira, the buttons look the same as they do on Confluence, the same as they do on any other Atlassian product that you have to use. And it's just their way of keeping things consistent. They just have their own sort of library that they can build all of their new projects and all their new sites with. And Twitter, I just use this as a site example, but just to sort of highlight the fact that even a basic site, you know, they have the buttons are all sort of a component, they have like quotes as a component, things like that. So you can use them on a site, although it's less common if you've just got one basic sort of site. So why would you want to use one? First of all, I'm going to talk about why it benefits your users and what impact it has on them, and then I'll go into what impact it has on your teams. Biggest one for users is branding. This is why companies like to sort of lean on design and component libraries, because you want to have that company feel. You know, if you've got 5 projects in your company, you don't really want them all to look totally different and 5 different apps where no one realizes that it's the same thing. You want people to go on and go, yep, I have used other products by this company, it feels the exact same, I know where I'm going, and it reminds me of the company and what the company does, and it feels safe, so I feel like I know what I'm doing as soon as I jump into a new one, because I've used an old one before. And of course, because it gets the company logos, company fonts, company colors, all that stuff in, so then they don't have to worry whenever developers are making their projects. They're like, okay, the fonts are all there, the colors are all there, there's not going to be anything crazy that we haven't approved, haven't checked, whatever else. And then consistency, so it sort of falls into that a bit. You know, there's a bit of an overlap there. If you go into Jira, as I mentioned, you know that a certain thing is where the like user profile thing's going to be, you know where the menu's going to be, you know what the buttons look like that you're looking for in certain areas. And again, it links the product. So if you're in, you know, say you use Jira every day, and then you're like, okay, we really need like a wiki type project. You go to Confluence, you go, okay, that looks safe. We know it. We've seen something like this before. We've seen buttons like this before. We can probably figure it out. It looks familiar enough. And then also the third point, which is forcing consistency. So one example that a lot of companies have that we have in Bazaar Voice is a system where you sort of have like a user portal, and then you've got a bunch of apps inside that user portal. You want to make sure that a bunch of different teams can work on totally different apps within the system, and they don't have to be talking to each other every day, and they don't have to be stealing code from each other to keep everything consistent or have everything look totally separate. You just have a component library, everyone can grab from the same things, and everything magically looks nice, it all fits in, it all works within this portal. So how does this help your team? What about this will make things a bit easier, a bit nicer? Why is it worth using for your team? Familiarity is a big one. For a designer, first of all, if you're sort of starting on a project or starting in a company, it's easy to see the themes, it's easy to see where things are going. If you need to design a new component, you know, you've got an idea, you're not starting from scratch every time, because you can sort of extrapolate from what's already there. And for developers, it's a big thing, I think, because like say you're going, okay, I just want to, you know, make a small change. There's a whole system and it's all got a really consistent and similar way of being built and of being put together, and you don't have to go and figure it out and guess and just throw it in and try and make it match. And it's an efficient way to use developer and UX and designer time. So like if you want to say, okay, we want to go and make, like, you know, say I want a drop down of you know, countries or something of where people are, or states. Do I have to go and research and see what way do people prefer it in alphabetical order? Do they prefer this order? We have to get feedback. Somebody in your company or your team has probably done that before, and they've probably got that research before, and they probably know what users prefer, and there's no point doing that 5 times for 5 apps. This way you can say, okay, we've done this, we've worked this out, we can put it in, and it saves that time. And obviously the obvious developer benefit that you don't have to write things every time. Like, oh, I want to, you know, build a color picker, I want to build a date picker, I want to build a contact form with buttons and save buttons and whatever else. You're not going to start and do that from scratch every time. If you have to build a country drop down, you're not going to go and find a list of countries and work out what format you have to send it to your database in and build that all up and put it somewhere. If someone else is already doing that, why wouldn't you just use it again? And why wouldn't you just formalize it so that you get those other benefits as well? You get the consistency, you get the familiarity for your users of what they're going to find. And support, which is a lovely benefit, because if someone's done it before, hopefully in theory, if they're formalizing it and they're saving it to a component library, they're also documenting it and they're also testing it. You know, not always, but hopefully, fingers crossed. And the same with public things, you know, things like Angular and React, all these things, they have huge documentation behind them. So you're not going to go and have to hunt for, you know, 45 minutes on Stack Overflow to find out how to implement something, or if there's like a slight bug that you're not sure about, because so many people have probably hit it before and have had the same problems. Whereas if you're implementing your own versions of everything from scratch every time, you might come across really weird bugs because it's all your own code, and it could take ages to dig into what you might have done that might have caused it, when you could get the same component, the same end result with something that lots of people have worked with. And yeah, the existing community also just means that you have a lot of experience with those components. So even if it's internal to your company, if you go, okay, we have this thing, we're trying to like build a new contact page or something, you can go, has anyone done this before? Yeah, we used this and this made sense, this didn't really work. And it's easy enough because you're all working in the same language, you're all dealing with the same things every day, so you know what works and what doesn't work, and you sort of short out that barrier of having to explain your entire stack and your entire sort of concept for how you've built everything. So yeah, the downsides, there are obviously things, I wouldn't say they're not like deal breakers, but there are things that you have to be aware of and things you have to watch out for if you decide to go for this sort of system. Basically because yeah, the basic things, the standard things won't always work. Sometimes there's a component that will work for 4 out of 5 of your apps, but it just won't work for the 5th project or the 5th app, and there's no like, you know, you shouldn't have to squeeze it and force it in. Sometimes you just have to go accept it and say, okay, that's fine. We'll use something similar, we'll build something new, we'll add it into the component library, we'll build it on it. or whatever else, or we'll just keep our thing for us because it's weird and it's really domain specific and no one else will need it. Accessibility. I did warn that this would come up because this is what I rant about all the time. So context awareness, this is a big thing. If you're using components, you have to make sure that the page knows what the components are, the components know what the page is. If you're putting all these tiny components in, you can put like a prop in your component or a property in, and it'll know certain things, you know, accessibility wise for screen readers and everything else. But if there's not that context of the whole page, if you've got a wrapper that has things inside it that it doesn't know about, then those tools aren't going to work and you're going to sort of have a huge mess. And the ability to link between components, say for example you have a form, you have an input and that's all fine and you use the same input everywhere. You have a label, it's a nice component because it's got the right fonts and it's got the right spacing and everything else. And you think, okay, that's great, I've got my two components, from my components library, it's all going to work. But if you don't have the options to link those two, for screen readers, for everything else, then it's falling apart because suddenly you've got a label and you've got an input and there's no link between them. So you have to make sure when you're building these components that even though sometimes you might use this label with a different thing or in a different place, you have to be aware of being able to create those links and create the sort of context and the details around the page so that everything works together. The benefit of this, or the upside of this, is that with things like Angular and React and all these big libraries, a lot of the time if you use those public libraries and public sort of frameworks, that a lot of the stuff is built in. Like a lot of the Angular stuff, for example, really comes with a lot of accessibility features and functionality. A lot of it's been researched really heavily and it's in there already. So it's just a case of making sure that you pay attention to it and you're aware of it and you don't make more of a mess than by just not doing anything. But you should never not do anything. The other thing is, defaults. There's a lot of things and a lot of research and UX research into defaults in general. But especially if you're reusing components a lot of the time, you can sort of think, okay, well, we created this component for our app, we built the default because that's what makes sense, and then we threw it in our component library. And then if someone else just grabs it and uses it and hasn't really paid attention, the default option might not make sense. If I have a project that is only available in the US, I build it and then the locations is all the states, and then I go, okay, we've got a project that's EU only, so we're going to release it and we're going to throw in all the same address components. Suddenly, okay, I can't pick a country, but I can pick a state. That doesn't help me. I need to, you need to be aware of what are the defaults and should it be a default? Should this be something you have to explicitly choose every time? Same with things being too specific or too generic. If you have if you're making a form and someone has to select, like, those forms where you have to fill in for like visas and taxes or whatever, and you have to fill in your job, and then you go and you pick one and there's a list and they're super vague and you have no idea which category your job actually fits into. So you pick one and then a second box shows up and none of them are anything to do with your job, so you have to go back to the first one and reselect it and keep trying until you get to the right one that looks vaguely like the job that's actually the job you do. And it just causes a lot of confusion. It wastes users' time because they've sort of gone, well, we're trying to be vague so that people can pick the right one, but it can actually just be more confusing for people. Or you try to be too specific to the point where people feel like it's not quite right, so I don't know if I should pick it and I'm scared to make the wrong choice. And lack of precision. A big example of this is, all those websites where you have to have an age. You have to put in like your age to use them, like Facebook, you have to be 13, whatever else, 16. If you put in a default date that's like default 18, no one's going to change their age. No 16-year-old is going, I should be honest. I shouldn't say I'm 18, I should say I'm 16 and not let myself go onto this website, because they're never going to do that. There's no interest, there's no user benefit to correcting their age address if you just leave it at default. But equally, like, the worst thing in the world is if you have a date of birth field and you default it to today's date, especially on mobile, because everyone in the world will hate you when they have to click to go through every month from now until when they were born. It's just painful and awful. And a lot of that all leads to potential unintended consequences. You end up with bad and inaccurate data in your databases, and then any assumptions you make or any work that you do based on that is just going to be a mess, because your system has encouraged people to put in the easiest data rather than the most accurate and the most correct data. So anything you do, you have a system that tries to, machine learning or whatever else, it tries to group people. It tries to work out, make assumptions about people and put them into categories. It can't do that because everything's wrong, because it was just, well, I put in the easiest thing and the thing that seemed close enough to what I wanted, because I couldn't be bothered to go through the 17 different options and selects and drop downs to figure out what I actually needed. Yeah, complexity. I think this is a big one that can potentially put a lot of people off component libraries. So the two sort of top options kind of build into one. It's like, say, okay, I want to build a button component. I just want a button, and it's going to be used in a lot of places. I'm going to have a cancel button and a save button and an open button and whatever else. You have options here. You can either go, this is a button and it's just a button and it doesn't know anything about anything, and I'm going to pass it every single property every time that it needs. But then you might feel like, well, then I could just use the browser's button. I'm not, HTML button element, I'm not really gaining any benefit because I have to pass it everything every time. All I'm getting is maybe a couple of default styles. But on the other hand, where you could go is the complete opposite, and you say, I'm going to make a save button component and a cancel button component and an open button component, and you could have a system where those are almost exactly identical and all you're passing them as a function, but then you've built 20 buttons, 20 components instead of one. So it's really all about getting that balance, and it's one of those things that's constantly going to change as you work through your system. You're going to realize, maybe that should be different, maybe that one didn't make sense, maybe we've made it too generic and we're having to do too much work every time we use it, or maybe we're just building too many versions of this and it's silly and our component library has 30 versions of one thing when we really only need maybe 5 versions of it. And then things like right to left languages, emojis, if emojis are going to suddenly appear in things where people are typing, you have to be aware of these things whenever it comes to, like, if you have a bunch of your components, and usually you'll build your styles into them, so it's not just the functionality. But if all of your styles are built into your components and all of these assumptions are made, and then you suddenly go, okay, we now have to release this in a country that uses right to left languages, everything could be a mess, and you have to be aware of that, and you might have to consider, do we have to tell it at some level of one of these components that there's going to be things like this in here? Do we build all of our components again for different types of languages and different types of scripts, or do we just tell every component that that's what it's going to have to deal with? It's just about getting that balance. There's no perfect, this is the way you should do it, and there's no other way. It's just what works for your project. And iteration and improvement. This is my personal biggest sort of bugbear with component libraries, particularly not so much like publicly available ones, but company internal and project specific ones, is that it's really easy and really tempting to go, okay, we made a component library, done, that's it, I've done it. I have a button, I have an input, I have a form, I have whatever I need, and that's the end, and I'm going away forever and never touching this. But obviously that doesn't make sense, and you wouldn't do it on any other project. You would never go, we made our MVP project and we set it down and we never touched it ever again for the rest of our lives, because it doesn't make sense. You're going to be using these components in projects and in apps over and over again, and you're going to constantly come up with things where something didn't quite work, didn't make sense, could have been better. There's no point constantly, if you make the same change, if you have to change a component in the same way in 5 apps, why wouldn't you port that back into your component library? Why wouldn't you upgrade it? Because you're just giving yourself more work in the end, and you're sort of getting rid of the benefit of having it. It can be really easy to, or really scary, not really easy to, change things. You might go, but okay, we made that component and everyone's using it, and if I change it, there could be uproar, people could complain, and it might not work. But I think communication solves that. I think that there's no point saying, well, everyone's using it, so we could just never change it, because everyone might be using it, but they might also all be saying this is really awkward or this doesn't make sense for us, but it's the best we have. And it's just about getting over that fear, and it's just not making your component library into this like holy grail thing that no one touches and that no one's allowed to go anywhere near. Certainly we have a component system in a component library that we use in Bazaar Voice, but the whole point is that anyone can sort of get involved. Anyone can say, you know what, I think there's a better way to do this, or I think we should have an alternative version of this. And it's just about constantly having that change, having that feedback, having meetings and say, have we thought about doing it this way? Have we thought about adding this option, whatever else? Just not making it the special child that never gets touched or interrupted. And then, there's the lack of fun changing work fear slightly. I think, of people sort of thinking, okay, well, if I'm a designer and there's a component library built, is that it? Is there nothing left for me to ever do again because everything is already done? But again, I don't think so. I think if you're constantly changing and you're constantly doing stuff, there is that work to be done. And I mean, having a component library shouldn't be the end of your system, because UX is still a thing and the overall system's still a thing, and you still have different users for different apps, or else it would all be one app to begin with. So there's still work there to be done. It's not like, you know, you don't go, okay, we have a component library, so that's every decision ever made for the rest of our products for the rest of our lives. Because you'll just, you know, suddenly you'll look back and go, this looks like it was designed in 1995 and we regret everything. Because you have never changed it and you've never upgraded it and you haven't been constantly looking at it. And sometimes that'll mean holding off and doing a big upgrade at once. Sometimes that'll mean just upgrading components as you go, as things sort of make sense. So in conclusion, is it for me? I think it's all about thinking, does it make sense for my project? Does it make sense for what I'm doing? If you're saying, oh, it's Friday and I'm about to do a 3-day hackathon and I'm really excited for this project, probably you don't need a component library, because you'll get to midday on Sunday and go, I haven't made anything except a component library. I haven't started an actual project, but I have loads of really nice buttons and I'm ready to start. If you're building your personal portfolio, it's a one-time thing and it's going to be really customized, and unless you have a lot of things that build on that brand, on your particular look, you probably don't need a component library. On the other hand, if you're a large company, if you have a lot of products or a lot of apps and you want them to look the same, even if it's just you have a website and you have, you know, a mobile app, if you're using React and React Native, you want to have as much as you can in common between those things, because you don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. You don't want to have to do the same things over and over and over again. So it's just hitting that compromise. Like I said, you know, none of those dangers are absolute deal breakers. None of those are, okay, yeah, that sounds scary, that sounds difficult, let's never do it. They're just things that you have to think about and be aware of and weigh up whenever you're going, does it make sense to do this? Does it not make sense? Should I just give up forever? Just, yeah, make a decision, weigh it up, decide. And I mean, the other thing is, you can get halfway through an app and halfway through a couple of apps and then go, actually, now it does make sense to make a component library. Maybe it didn't at first because we had one small project because we were a tiny startup and we hadn't really the bandwidth or the time to do this. But we have a couple things now and they all look really similar, and maybe now we should put them all together because we can see the common things and the common threads between them. Yeah, so questions? As I said, we'll be here for the rest of the day. I'll be in the after party, probably try and get me earlier rather than later in the after party. But yeah, questions? Any questions?
Just on, you're saying, you know, it'll work in 4 out of 5 user scenarios. You know, obviously whenever you're doing this, you're doing it on a nice, clean page. What happens in that first scenario, you know, whenever you try and use your component in a table and it just doesn't align, do you duplicate the component to have one that just works in tables and one that works everywhere else, or do you sort of try and reinvent it?
So I'm repeating the question for the sake of the video. Basically, and people at the back, if you have a component that works 4 out of 5 cases, what do you do in the 5th case? What do you do when it fits almost everywhere but not everywhere? Am I right?
Yeah.
I think in that case, it's sort of, again, it depends, which seems like a cheating answer. But essentially, it's like, do I think I'm going to use this often? Do I think this is something that could come back? It could come up for a 2nd time or a 3rd time? And also, what is the, you know, how heavy is that task? Is it a task where it's really simple to throw out an alternate version because we're only going to use it this one time, or because it's a really simple component? If it's something that you might use again, or if it's something that is quite an involved task but you're in the middle of doing it, I think sometimes, even if it is the only one, if it's involved and if you're in that mind space, it might make sense to build that alternative version, and then you have it ready and you have that option, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Cool. Any other questions? No questions
from the floor?
I'm happy if there's not, like, that's fine. I'm not like desperate for questions.
I'll ask you one then.
Thanks.
So I'm just a stupid, lazy developer. Let's say, for instance, I have a new project which may or may not actually exist right now. out of everything you said in terms of complexity, flexibility, and accessibility, of course,
Yes.
if I was really, if I was to choose or had to choose component library, which one should I choose?
Ooh, it's a tough one. I mean, I guess it depends on what you need from it. It depends, like, things like Bootstrap are really simple and they really don't enforce anything on you. If you want to go something more like Angular's material library, you're going to have more, I don't want to say compromises, but you know, you're going to have to make decisions based on that for your system. So I think it all hinges on how much you're willing to, you know, base your decisions on the framework that you want to use versus have something that's completely, you know, lacking in opinions and just lets you do whatever you want and slap it on top.
Sure.
Basically.
I just want buttons that fit where I tell them.
Yeah, things.
So it doesn't look like a Google app.
Yeah, so things like semantic UI, you know, where you're saying, okay, it'll just make my drop downs look like they have nice rounded edges and they're not from Safari defaults and whatever else. You know, those things sort of make sense. They're not going to impede any functional decisions that you make, but it's just those little polishes on top. That's probably what you're looking for.
Semantic is one I hadn't heard of before. Thank you very much.
No worries.
No one, anything else? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, so style components framework. Used
I have used it.
help or hindrance? You think?
I'm gonna be slightly controversial and say I guess it depends on the project because the one time that I've used it, like where I've inherited on a project, I wasn't a fan.
I wasn't to start with either.
Yeah.
No.
Ooh.
But yeah.
It's I think it really, for me, it really relies on being set up really well at the start. Like if the project in question that I worked with it on was one of those, this is a prototype, guys, it's never going to go live, we swear it's definitely not going to be the live project. Oh wait, it is accidentally. Which means that you're never set up well and you never have those good sort of principles in from the start. I think it can be a good process, but you have to be really aware of what you're doing and really organized from the start to use them.
In the event you have a component that works on, let's say, desktops and tablets, but once you shrink the mobile size, it doesn't really work anymore. Is it worth just designing a separate mobile component or redesigning it?
I guess it depends on the component for sure. Like, I mean, if it's something like, you know, a label or a button, you're just going to try and build that sort of, you know, build it mobile first, build that flexibility into it. Obviously, when it comes to things like a table, you might want to think maybe we do have a mobile table because maybe there's too much of a difference. Maybe it's a whole other data structure that we're passing into it. So yeah, I think that sort of makes a difference is how complex is it and how much do we change what we're doing with it or what we're passing into it. If it's a big difference, then it probably makes sense to build something different. That everyone? Cool.
That's all. Okay, I'll just say that if something Claire said has sparked something in your head, use the whiteboard outside to put up a discussion point or something you might want to talk about later. As Claire said, she'll be about
Yes.
sober for most of the time.
I mean, I'm not going to promise,
You're
but
not
yeah.
gonna promise anything. None of us are.